Greg, I want to put a hypothetical scenario on the table and get your perspective on this. So let's say I'm working with a dietitian who is qualified to give me a full meal plan.
Mm-hmm.
And this dietitian that I'm working with, we have very ambitious goals. We want to try to kind of thread the needle and peak for two very different sports at the same time. Maybe a professional bodybuilding show and even something way different like a professional classic bodybuilding show.
Okay.
So it's an ambitious protocol we're putting together. And they're helping me with my fat loss as I prepare for these competitions. And so they say, Eric, you're supposed to have chicken and sweet potato for this meal. And I say, well, I'm sick of this food. I can't bear to eat more chicken and sweet potato. Instead, I want to have some turkey and a white potato. Now, I'm going to arrange them so that the carbs, fat, protein, fiber, hypothetically, I'm going to make it all work. Am I making an upgrade, a downgrade, or am I going to be making the same exact amount of progress moving forward?
I think you'll probably make... Well, it depends on the extent to which you subscribe to the John Harbaugh School of Nutrition.
That's interesting.
I think the published research would tend to suggest that you would probably make about the same progress with both of those approaches, but as we know, chicken is a nervous bird, and maybe if you're trying to win, you don't want a bunch of chicken in your diet. I don't know where turkey fits on the nervous bird hierarchy. But to answer that question, we might need to call in an expert. They do run if you get too close to them in the forest, like wild turkeys, so they might be nervous birds as well. If they are conditional on that, I would say probably similar progress with both approaches.
Now, my understanding is that Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey to be the national bird of the United States, so that tells me that they've got, they're a little bit more resilient, a little bit tougher than a chicken, I would assume, just in terms of their, their temperament and their composition.
Yeah, but Ben Franklin also wasn't your classic tough guy.
That's true. But anyway, so do you know the acronym IIFYM?
Yes.
Stands for If It Fits Your Macros. Do you know where that came from originally?
I thought it came from the bodybuilding.com MISC board, but I don't know if that's true.
So my understanding, I don't know the exact area where it popped up. I believe that's correct, but whatever. I'm not going to commit to it without doing the research on it. But the general vibe, the reason that this whole acronym came to be is because people were on these, bodybuilding message boards saying, well, I want to swap out this food for that food. I want to swap out that food for the other food. Can I do this and still succeed with my weight loss goal or hypertrophy goal or whatever the case is? And people would say, dude, if it fits your macros, just do it. It's fine. If you're equating your carb, fat, and protein intake, and in some cases your fiber intake for the day as well, usually fiber they talk about across the whole day, not within an individual food swap. But if it fits the macro plan, the carb, fat, and protein target that you're shooting for every day, just do it. It's fine. You're going to end up in the same place. And that, that whole idea of if it fits your macros, the more kind of formal term for that has gained popularity is flexible dieting. And flexible dieting, the flexible part pertains to flexibility with regards to food source selection. Basically, the idea is flexible dieting means you can choose whatever food sources you prefer to hit your macro targets on a daily basis and make totally satisfactory progress toward your body composition goals. And flexible dieting, or if it fits your macros, it is a valid concept. It works. Broadly speaking, you are not restricted to the 7 classic bodybuilder foods, right? So back in the day when people started cutting, they would say, oh, I have to eat this very rigid, restrictive, short list of foods that bodybuilders just traditionally eat. It was a lot of white fish like tilapia, I don't know how to say it. Chicken breast, rice, sweet potato, broccoli, the whole deal. There's a classic video back in the day where someone was prepping for a bodybuilding show, and literally all he ate was, I think it was fish and rice cakes. Do you ever see that video?
Yeah.
But yeah, so people were restricting themselves to these very tiny food lists, and it was unnecessary, right? So people, and this was a very positive thing, a net benefit here for the bodybuilding world and the fitness world collectively. This idea of flexible dieting, if it fits your macros, this is valid and it works. And it indicates that we have a lot of flexibility for what food choices we make, what food sources we select to hit our daily macro targets. However, there has been a downside of, this trend in which people have broadly embraced that concept. And I want to demonstrate the downside by sharing two different statements. So the first statement is as follows. You have flexibility to select from a wide range of food sources in accordance with your goals and preferences. There are no foods that are fully off limits for fitness enthusiasts. That's a true statement. That's good. Mm-hmm. The second statement, food source selection doesn't matter. A lot of people have transitioned from the first sentence to the second, the first statement to the second, almost kind of implying equivalence. And the purpose of my segment here is to highlight the fact that those are two very different statements. Mm-hmm. And what I'm trying to get at here is when it comes to food source selection, you can pick from an almost limitless range of food sources. That part of flexible dieting I absolutely support. It's simply true. But I think a lot of times people try to take that a step further and act like food source selection is completely meaningless, like it has no impact on your dietary progress and success. And I don't think that is true, because my belief, based on the research, is that food source selection is a variable that we can strategically leverage. We can make food swaps strategically to set ourselves up for a diet that is basically going to set us up for more success as we move forward. So before I get into that, I want to give a little bit of background information about the regulation of food intake. And I'm just completely pulling this from a really incredible guest article that we had in the Mass Research Review by Dr. Anne Catherine Eiselt. And it was all about the kind of neurophysiological elements of food intake regulation. So food intake, as she explained in this article, is regulated by several interrelated brain circuits. And as I talk through this, I'm going to show some images on the screen that kind of show what these circuits look like. So the first one is the hunger circuit. And there are, of course, a number of gut-derived hormones and hormones derived from adipose tissue or produced by adipose tissue that work their way up into the hypothalamus and relay signals about the regulation of hunger. There's also the satiety circuit. And what we see is that the satiety circuit involves a number of different brain structures they're all in the hypothalamus and hindbrain regions, but it's certainly a complicated circuit with a lot of different brain structures that are involved in this communication and this regulation. And there are a number of peripheral structures that are highly involved in that satiety circuit as well.
Also, can I just say, brain circuits sound like stuff out of sci-fi.
Yes.
Like arcuate nucleus, ventral tegmental area, dorsal striatum. Like that all sounds like places in like a sci-fi city or something.
Absolutely. Yeah, the brain stuff gets serious. But the third brain circuit that I want to talk about here is the consumption circuit. This is another one where the hypothalamus is heavily involved, and it includes reward responses to hyperpalatable food. Okay, so we've got hunger, satiety, and then this consumption circuit, which involves the reward centers in our brain, and specifically how they relate to the consumption of food that's hyperpalatable or just really, really, really tasty, and gives us this really nice sensation of reward when we consume them. Mm-hmm. So another brain structure that's involved here, which is a little bit simpler, is the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is heavily involved with goal-directed behavior and impulse control. So the prefrontal cortex, the hypothalamus, the hindbrain, we've got all these different brain structures and areas that are working together, conveying different signals, but they're integrating all of this peripheral information so that we can kind of control our food intake. And there's this kind of give and take between these different systems, right? Now, the reason that I bring that up, this kind of integrated control of feeding, is because it's pretty important when we talk about swapping out food sources, right? So let's say that you are weighing one carb source versus another, or one protein source versus another. A lot of people like to reduce that and basically say, well, carbs are carbs, protein is protein, right? So when we talk about food sources and how they impact hunger and satiety, one of the most common questions people ask is, are carbs more satiating than fats? Or is protein more satiating than carbs? A lot of people like to break it down simply into macros. And there's some utility of that. But I think that's the wrong question to ask when it comes to how is this food going to actually influence my feeding behaviors, my actual food intake, because there are all these different brain structures that are kind of conveying all these different messages and communicating with one another to collectively modulate energy intake. So a lot of times with satiety or regulation of intake, people want to make it just a question about macro content. And I think that's the wrong question to be asking. It's not irrelevant, but it's way too superficial to really get to the root of what you're trying to figure out here when you're weighing one food source versus another. Mm-hmm. So things you want to ask yourself are these two different food sources that I'm comparing. Do they impact my brain's reward system to the same extent? And things that are going to play into that would be the aroma, the flavor, the mouthfeel of the food, the ease of consumption, other contextual factors that will influence your experience, your subjective experience of consuming that food. Are they going to impact satiety to the same extent? Of course, macronutrient breakdown plays a role, but normally with food swaps, we're talking about meals that we kind of assume the macro content is going to be relatively equated in this context. But we want to look at things like, what is the mass of this meal? What is the volume of the meal? The texture, the rate of consumption, the fiber content, the water content, the energy density, which of course is kind of tied in with several of those elements. And then also when we're comparing two different food sources, we might ask ourselves, do these food sources actually play the same role within the meal and interact with other foods the same way? There are some foods that kind of make us want to consume more of a different food because they go really well together. Mm-hmm. And there are other foods that we could put it in a meal and it would not have that same effect. There's almost a bit of synergy where certain food pairings, we say those two together, those make it really hard to put the spoon down, right? Yeah. So there's a lot that goes into potential food swaps, and we have to keep that in mind.
I think a good example of that, because I think that may come across as like abstract to some folks.
Yeah.
But I think a good example of that is if someone is really into eating chicken wings, like the carrots and celery that come with the chicken wings are just kind of like to give your mouth a break just from the heat of the wings to kind of cool off, so you can go in with more wings. So like theoretically, like, if you get an order of 20 wings and that's all you could eat, maybe you might want to only eat 10 or maybe a dozen of them before you're just like, oh, this is just, it's salty, vinegary, spicy, like I'm kind of done with this, but then if you can kind of cool off with a little celery, maybe dipped in some blue cheese dressing, you're like, ooh, this is nice, little flavor contrast, texture contrast, cool the mouth down. It would be good. Some more fatty, spicy, vinegary, salty chicken wings.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and one that comes to mind for me is a really simple one, but the idea of having coffee versus green tea. Mm-hmm. So in a vacuum, I enjoy both of them very much. But when I drink coffee, sometimes I say, what would go great with this? Something chocolatey, or maybe a pastry, or something sweet, or kind of like a creamy, like dessert type of thing. Mm-hmm. When I drink green tea, this could totally be just my perspective. I don't think a lot of foods go particularly well with green tea, or at least not a lot of foods that I consume regularly. Mm-hmm. So if I drink green tea, I can say this is a lovely cup of tea and I don't want anything else.
Yeah.
This is great. But when I drink coffee, I do start to want something that's sweet or chocolatey or something like that. And so it's one thing where a little beverage swap can really make a big difference about what other foods you might gravitate toward. Mm-hmm. Or if I was eating something that goes well with coffee, if I was going to end my meal with coffee, maybe I'm more likely to actually continue that meal and eat even more.
Yeah.
Versus if I had some tea after that meal and it was just a clear signal, okay, meal's over, we're on to a completely different set of flavors here, right? So that's what I'm getting at, is the fact that when we talk about making a food swap, it's not just about if the macros equate. We have to consider a broader picture of how all these different brain structures communicate with one another and regulate food intake. And a great example, like I said, the prefrontal cortex is heavily involved with goal-directed behavior. One of the things that can be really helpful with food source selection is if we don't necessarily have to work too hard to kind of, so if you eat a lot of really hyper palatable meals that for you are just a 10 out of 10 on the flavor scale.
Yeah.
You're like, this is incredible. Every time the meal ends, it's a tragedy. You are really pushing yourself to weigh this massive reward response versus goal-directed behavior. And there's this tug of war that you are really amplifying by doing that. And so one of the things...
When your internal dialogue is Guy Fieri's external dialogue on diners, drive-ins, and dives, you might run into issues. Exactly.
And so, again, we can strategically leverage that and say, you know what? If I dropped from a meal that for me is just a 10 out of 10 in terms of palatability, and I went to like a 7 out of 10 and it was still a very nice meal, but I can be done with it and not just feel absolutely distraught that the meal's over, that can be a really helpful thing when dieting. So when I transition to a fat loss phase, I do something that some people view as counterintuitive, but I actually go toward foods that are slightly less palatable rather than trying to say, okay, I only have 2,100 calories today. How do I make that as palatable as possible? Which a lot of people do. And frankly, I kind of think they'd be better off if they didn't go that route. So what I'm getting at here is foods contribute a lot more than their macros, not just in terms of like micronutrients and stuff like that, but also in how they impact our body's systems that regulate food intake. And that means, we have to look at food sources and consider more than just, making the macros fit. There's a lot more that goes into it when it comes to regulation of food intake. So what I want to do is look at a couple studies that have said, okay, let's actually put this to the test. So let's not just say, okay, protein is more satiating than carbs, so if you want to be satiated, eat more protein. Let's look at actual foods and see how they impact subjective satiety levels and also how much people tend to eat after the meal or in combination with that food, right? So the first paper I want to look at is a classic by Holt and colleagues in 1995. If you've ever heard of the satiety index, this is where it originated. What they did was they gave servings of 1,000 kilojoules, which is 240 kilocalories or capital C calories. They looked at 38 different foods split into 6 different food categories. So fruits, bakery products, snack foods, carbohydrate-rich foods, protein-rich foods, and breakfast cereals. And they fed these servings to these individuals in the study and looked at their satiety ratings over the next 120 minutes or 2 hours. And what I'm going to show on the screen is the general finding here. What they did was they made white bread the kind of standard score of 100%. So all of these were framed as a satiety index score as a percentage in comparison to white bread. So anything over 100% was more satiating than white bread, and anything under 100% was less satiating than white bread. Again, giving a 240 calorie serving of all these different foods in isolation. And so generally speaking, when you look at the satiety index, it was a really great piece of research, a very valuable thing that was contributed. The general pattern was that foods with low energy density, high fiber content, high water content, those were generally foods that in a vacuum lent themselves to greater satiety responses. And that's pretty straightforward, and it kind of conforms with, what most people consider to be kind of diet foods. When you go on a diet and you're trying to reduce calorie intake without starving all day, people do tend to gravitate toward these types of foods. So this was a great piece of research, but there was a shortcoming in the sense that this paper has low ecological validity. It's not very representative of real world eating scenarios because it's not very often that we say, I think I'm going to sit down and have 240 calories of white bread and nothing else.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to sit down and have 240 calories of white potatoes with absolutely nothing else, right? So what's really interesting is, looking at research that kind of builds upon this and says, well, in the context of a regular diet, in a free living individual who's eating meals with food combinations that they selected over the course of a real day in their normal life, what foods seem to be associated with greater or lesser energy intake, broadly speaking. So I want to talk about a paper by Horgan and colleagues, and that's exactly what they were looking at. So rather than looking at a controlled feeding scenario with a single isolated food, they said, let's look at all of your food records over a 4-day period. And they had 6,000 4-day diet records that were completed by a ton of people over in the United Kingdom. And they were looking at, if we sort these different foods into 60 distinct categories, how does each of these food categories influence overall energy intake? And I am going to show some figures that don't contain 60 categories because that would be a really big figure. So not all categories are represented within these figures, but they did sort these into a total of 60 categories. And they looked at this two different ways, which is really cool and really valuable. This was a very insightful way to look at it. They looked at how these different food categories influenced energy intake, both within individuals and between individuals. So within individuals, they're basically looking at how changing your intake of a particular food influences your kind of day-to-day fluctuation in energy intake. So on the days you ate more of this food, you ate fewer calories, and vice versa. They also looked at between individual differences. So in this case, they were looking at the people who eat more of this food seem to eat fewer calories than the people who eat less of this food, right? So that's kind of how you frame these two different ways of looking at the data between individuals and within individuals. So on the screen right now, you're going to see what they call the compensation coefficient between individuals. And generally speaking, the lower this value is, or the more negative, the more it leads to a reduction in energy intake. I know that's kind of a weird way to frame it, but you could, I don't want to use satiety incorrectly here because that's not strictly what it is. But when you have a low coefficient, it basically means the people who eat more of these low coefficient foods tend to eat less than the people who are eating more high coefficient foods. That's kind of the very basic surface level interpretation. So if you were going to be, for example, choosing foods that would help you reduce your energy intake very passively, you would want to be selecting foods with a low coefficient, right? And so you can kind of look at these, and I'm going to give a broad summary so people aren't just like looking through, dozens of categories here. I'm also going to display the data here for the coefficients within individuals. So again, just looking at the data a slightly different way. And what you see is, generally speaking, you look at the top of these figures with some of these low coefficient food groups: skim milk, a lot of high fiber, breakfast cereals, fruit, things like that. Stuff that's generally have some pretty similar characteristics that I'll get into. But one of the things that's really fascinating when you look through this is there's a lot of variability, a lot of noise in the data from food to food. It's not like the first three are all vegetables and then the second three are all fruits and then the next three, it's not neatly categorized in the way you would expect. And there are some foods that kind of surprise you a little bit, right? So, for example, smoothies end up being a really high coefficient food, whereas most people would say, hey, you're putting some fruit, maybe some vegetables, a little bit of yogurt in there with some milk, seems healthy enough to me, ends up being a really high coefficient food. One of the things that I thought was really funny was, man, I've seen so much bad internet content about like, oh man, butter is so good for you. It's a superfood. You should spread it on everything. polyunsaturated fatty acids, basically poison, stay away from them at all costs. I've seen other people saying, no, PUFA's higher satiety per calorie, better from a cardiometabolic standpoint. Definitely go with these PUFA-based spreads, these polyunsaturated fat-based spreads. When you look at it in the context of this, it's like, man, what a useless argument to go down. Like in terms of like when people make arguments about like, oh, all you have to do is swap your margarine for butter and you're going to reduce your energy intake, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And when it comes to impacts on energy intake, they're looking pretty similar. Now, different cardiometabolic effects for sure. I don't want to make it seem like they have completely equivalent effects on blood lipids. That's not the case, but that's a discussion for a different time. But anyway, if we look at the results and paint with a broad brush, like I said, there are some interesting instances where, like, for example, specific alcoholic beverages might find themselves in very different standings in terms of the actual coefficient. There was a lot of variability and a lot of noise when you go from food to food, and it didn't fit into these like perfectly tidy bins that you could categorize easily. But a few notable food categories with low coefficients were foods that had low energy density, foods with high fiber content, and foods that were artificially sweetened. Foods and beverages, I should say, that were artificially sweetened. Some things with high coefficients, again, lending themselves to higher total energy intake in the day, were foods that generally tended to be very snackable, just based on the context in which they're normally eaten. Alcoholic beverages generally, but not in all cases. Spreads that you might put on a bread-based product. So like butter, margarine, jam, jellies, they were all pretty high coefficient things. And that's to be expected based on the context in which they're consumed. And then full sugar beverages were definitely a high coefficient category. And we could kind of lump smoothies into that because a lot of commercially prepared smoothies do tend to be quite high in sugar, a lot higher than most people anticipate.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to mention here is that I'm not saying we should be using this totally in place of the satiety index because, it's not a better or worse situation when we look at these coefficients versus satiety index values, but these are two very different ways of viewing the problem, right? So these coefficients, they have a lot of ecological validity when we compare them to the satiety index study, but this is observational data. And I know this is cliche, but in this particular scenario, we have to be very cautious about resisting the urge to imply or infer causation based on correlation. So there might be a food that just because of the context in which it is routinely eaten, it lends itself to being lumped on like a high energy intake day or mixed with high energy intake foods. It may not be because of a specific characteristic of the food, but more reflective of the context in which it's consumed. So the practical takeaway here from this study, in light of some of those limitations or caveats, the results largely support the satiety promoting effects of a dietary pattern that features a lot of foods with low energy density, plenty of fiber, and it also reinforces the utility of switching from sugar-sweetened beverages to low-calorie beverages that are, flavored with either artificial or non-nutritive sweeteners. So things like, monk fruit extract, Splenda, sucralose, those are the same thing, aspartame, or your favorite stevia, which I know you're a big stevia head.
Completely untrue. And you'll be hearing from my lawyers that is slander per se.
Yes. They're also, I think these findings give us kind of a cautionary lesson, which is, we really ought to be mindful of extra calories that sneak in when, for example, we're at an event where we're drinking alcoholic beverages, or, in a social environment or situation where, we're very likely to just have high calorie snack food available. Being very, very conscious of calorie intake in those situations can be helpful. But I think the results also remind us to focus on broader eating patterns, whereas the satiety index kind of convinced people to look at individual foods in isolation. And ultimately, looking at broader eating patterns and kind of the entire matrix of the meal and how foods fit together and how eating one food causes you to eat more of another food. That's a really important aspect with food source selection that often gets overlooked. Other noteworthy studies on this topic of putting together meals strategically, there's one by Hall and colleagues. The title was Ultra-Processed Diets Cause Excess Calorie Intake and Weight Gain, an inpatient randomized controlled trial of ad libitum food intake. As you would guess based on the title, they found in this study that processed foods are generally consumed in excess for multiple different reasons. They're often consumed faster. They have a lower effect on suppressing appetite acutely. And yeah, there's a number of characteristics of these highly ultra-processed foods that, broadly speaking, can lend themselves to higher energy intakes. Along those lines, there's a study by Teo and colleagues called Texture-Based Differences in Eating Rate Influence Energy Intake for Minimally Processed and Ultra-Processed Meals. And so basically what they found was they didn't just look at the level of processing with meals, but also the texture of the meals. And they found that when people were given a soft and highly processed meal, they tend to eat more quickly and generally eat more. And when we look at the literature, looking at meals that are harder in texture and lower in their degree of processing, usually that's going to involve a little bit more chewing. We spend more time with the aromas and the flavors of that food. It gives our satiety signals a little bit more time to basically kick in upon the onset of eating. And so what they found in this study is that eating rate and energy intake were influenced by not just the degree of processing, but also just the texture of the food. Again, with hard textures and low degree of processing, generally promoting a slower eating rate and less energy intake. There's also a study by Flynn and colleagues that just came out very recently where they were looking at what actually sends the signal to kind of say, okay, the meal's over, let's shut it down, we're done eating. And what's really interesting is they looked at energy density and they found that changing the energy density of a meal was very useful from a strategic perspective, but only to a point. What they found was if you can incorporate some foods with low energy density, and energy density, what we're talking about there is the energy content in kilocalories divided by the mass of food in grams. And like I said, usually foods with a lot of fiber content and water content tend to be foods with low energy density. So, fibrous fruits and vegetables, melons, like watermelon has really low energy density, most green leafy vegetables, stuff like that. What they found was if you're able to incorporate foods with low energy density and get the energy density of your meal in its totality down to like 1.75 or 2 kilocalories per gram, in that particular scenario, the volume of food you're eating seems to be the limiting factor that convinces you, okay, meal's over, you've eaten plenty of just bulk food content. But when you get into meals that have higher energy density, so we're talking about over like 2.5, 3 kilocalories per gram, in that situation, it's usually just the calorie content of the meal that plays the rate limiting role in determining when it's time to stop eating. Mm-hmm. So even if you have this meal that's like 5 kilocalories per gram, like really high energy density, if you say, hey, I'm going to put in a couple stalks of celery to try to, cut into that energy density, it's probably not going to do much because it's going to bring you down from 5 to 4.8. And you're still in that range where calorie intake is the dominant signal. So just to give some kind of practical takeaways from the totality of this literature so that people can strategically revisit their food source selection. Number one, regulation of energy intake is really complex. It's really complicated, and it comes down to a lot more than macronutrient distribution. So it's absolutely true that flexible dieting is an effective strategy. It's absolutely true that mixing in different foods that fit your macros will absolutely keep you, on the road toward whatever goal you're pursuing, if you're still hitting your macros effectively. But what I'm trying to indicate in this segment is that we can make that job a little bit easier by choosing food sources strategically such that we are not working so hard to kind of override these different signals related to hunger, satiety, and hyperpalatability and the way that affects our reward control center. So we can, if it fits your macros, works, it's valid. Flexible dieting, totally valid, but we can strategically swap in different food sources in a way that really meaningfully impacts our ad libitum energy intake or just our desire to eat more when we're on a diet. So whether you're bulking or you're cutting or you're maintaining, I would encourage people to consider a few factors when they're selecting food sources. Number one is energy density. Again, high fiber content, high water content, low mass, looking at low energy per unit of mass or volume in that meal. Low energy density tends to be really helpful if you're struggling with hunger. If satiety is low and hunger is high, trying to have meals with low energy density is very helpful. And you could look at two different meals with the same macros, but one has different energy density. That is going to meaningfully influence your experience as a dieter. Both can get you where you're going with your body comp goal, but one path can be a lot easier than the other if you're struggling with hunger, right? Mm-hmm. And then if you're bulking, it goes the opposite direction. If you're like really struggling to get enough calories in and you're eating a bunch of really low energy density meals, you can strategically change that and go toward higher energy density meals and potentially make the process a little bit easier. So I'm not saying that, flexible dieting doesn't work. I'm saying that we can still work on that macro target framework, but make these meals a little bit more compatible with the way our body actually regulates energy intake.
Yeah.
Other things you want to keep in mind, and again, I want to reiterate, when you're talking about energy density and really trying to effectively leverage it, some of this new research indicates you want to look at meal level energy density, not just saying, oh, I'm going to bring some celery with my cheesecake and that's going to work out great, right? You want to try to get the whole meal into that range of being under like 1.75 or 2 kilocalories per gram. Mm-hmm. Other things, texture and level of processing. Again, if you're struggling with hunger and you want to boost satiety a little bit, harder texture, lower level of processing, generally speaking. That's painting with a broad brush, but these are the kind of trends and patterns we see. Foods that you're likely to consume slower probably will help. There are some foods like, for example, if you're eating nuts that you have to crack each nut individually, that's kind of a unique way to slow down your eating rate compared to just a big bowl of nuts that are already pre-shelled or pre-cracked, mm-hmm. right? So there's some really fun or interesting research where they'll take the same damn food and just find ways to make people eat it slower. And a slower rate of food intake can be helpful when it comes to promoting satiety.
Like that, like the classic apple juice study.
Yeah. There was a study where they had some people drink apple juice and like just out of a glass, and other people eat it like soup with a spoon. Slowing things down, changing texture. There's also studies apple related where they take a whole apple or a mashed up apple, and the whole apple tends to be better for satiety than mashing it up into a softer, more processed form. Palatability, again, you want your meals to taste good, but maybe not absolutely phenomenal when you're dieting, because that the way it lights up that reward signal or that reward center of your brain can actually override some of those satiety signals and lead to some degree of dysregulation of the hunger and satiety circuits. Dysregulation might be a strong word, but you can override satiety signals that would have otherwise convinced you, hey, we're good here. We don't need to eat more.
Yeah, that's like a distillation of the common saying, like, oh, there's always room for dessert.
Yeah.
You know, like you could be stuffed, but it's like, little bowl of ice cream, little slice of cheesecake. I can find room for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Texture, speed of consumption, palatability, food combinations. Like I said, you might consider saying, you know what? Whenever I eat this, I crave the other. So maybe I'm just going to not eat either of them and do a different food swap that's going to be, it's going to help me stay on track and not feel like I have to work so hard and use so much willpower to hit these macro targets on a daily target. And of course, anytime you're talking about food source, cost matters, ease of preparation matters, cooking and storage, the feasibility of making the food and having it when you need it. That stuff all matters. And so, like I said, the thing that's going to dictate your progress toward your body composition goal, your fitness goal, of course, a major element, probably the most important thing, is your macro targets, hitting the right general amount of, carbs, fats, and protein every day, and specifically your calorie intake and your protein intake. In most cases, those are the two numbers that are really going to dictate your body composition progress. Again, under the assumption that you're not like tremendously deficient in micronutrients, right? So the whole premise of setting macro targets and really prioritizing those and using food swaps that get you to those macro targets, completely valid. And I'm not trying to take away from that. What I'm trying to do is remind people you have a really valuable tool in your pocket, even when you're doing flexible dieting or this kind of if it fits your macros approach. You can strategically utilize food swaps and substitutions and leverage your food source selection in a way that doesn't make your diet necessarily more effective, but makes adherence easier and makes the process subjectively much more enjoyable. And it can take you from a place where a certain set of macro targets leaves you hungry every night to a situation where you actually feel, like you have a really high level of satiety, your hunger's under control, and you feel like you really don't have to exert too much willpower to hit those targets on a daily basis. So I would encourage people, if you're dieting, whether it's, like I said, weight gain, weight loss, weight maintenance, revisit your food source selection with all of these factors in mind and ask yourself, is there a way that I can strategically alter my food source selection, not to make my diet more effective, but to make it more feasible, more enjoyable, more in line with my preferences, and to help me regulate my hunger and satiety cues more effectively?